The air in Dr. Aris Thorne's bioengineering lab hung heavy with the metallic tang of burnt circuitry and something else, something acrid and deeply unsettling. Twisted steel girders groaned faintly, still settling from the catastrophic event that had ripped through the space. Glass walls, once transparent partitions to high-tech workstations, were now jagged teeth, reflecting the pulsating emergency lights like scattered rubies. This wasn't just a lab, it was a tomb, meticulously designed for groundbreaking research, now reduced to a testament of violent entropy. I stepped over a collapsed ventilation duct, my boots crunching on a mosaic of shattered monitors and pulverized concrete. The initial assessment was already being whispered among the uniformed officers, a tragic lab accident, perhaps a volatile reaction, or even a desperate act of self-destruction by a reclusive genius. Dr. Thorne, a name synonymous with innovation in genetic sequencing, lay dead amidst the wreckage, his body grotesquely contorted, partially obscured by a fallen beam. The medical examiner, a stoic woman with tired eyes, was already making her preliminary observations, her voice a low murmur against the crackle of distant radios. "Looks like a flash fire, Reed," he stated, not looking up from examination. "Massive thermal trauma, consistent with an uncontrolled energy release. Likely instantaneous." I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the devastation. The official narrative was straightforward, almost too neat. Thorne was known for pushing boundaries, for working with highly sensitive biological agents, for an intensity that bordered on obsession. A lab accident, especially one involving a bioengineer of his caliber, wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. Suicide, given the high-pressure world he inhabited, also couldn't be immediately dismissed. But my gut, a well-honed instrument after years of sifting through the aftermath of the sterile chill of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination bitted my exposed skin, sharper than any winter wind. The air, thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something final, clung to my coat. Before me, on the stainless steel table, lay Aris Thorne. His body, once animated by a brilliant if troubled mind, was now a still, stark testament to violence. I leaned closer, my breath fogging slightly in the frigid air. The lead examiner, a stoic woman with precise movements, gestured with a gloved hand. "Initial assessment points to a massive thermal event, Reed. Severe burns, consistent with an explosive force. Internal trauma suggests extreme concussive pressure." Her voice was low, clinical, echoing slightly in the quiet space. I nodded, my gaze sweeping over Thorne's form. The burns were extensive, particularly across his torso and arms, yet there was an asymmetry that bothered me. Some areas were deeply charred, almost to bone, while others, surprisingly adjacent, showed only superficial scorching. It was as if the heat had been directed, focused, rather than a general, chaotic blast. "And the cause of death?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Thermal shock, internal organ rupture, and massive trauma from projectile fragments," the examiner confirmed, her eyes scanning her notes. "Likely instantaneous." I traced an imaginary line with my finger along Thorne's jawline, observing the subtle discoloration. "Any foreign materials embedded?" "Microfragments of lab equipment, yes. Glass, some ceramic. Nothing unusual for a research facility accident." She paused, adjusting a light. "There's also evidence of an unusual localized electrical discharge, but that could be secondary to the primary event." My mind raced, piecing together the scene from the lab. The melted console,
The precise scorch marks on the floor, the lack of widespread structural damage. A catastrophic lab accident, yes, but one that felt too neat in its devastation, too contained. My gut churned with a familiar unease. Accidents were messy, unpredictable. This felt almost surgical. I want a full toxicology panel, I stated, my voice cutting through the silence. And a detailed analysis of all burn patterns. Pay close attention to the edges, the depths. The examiner gave a slight nod, accustomed to my particular brand of thoroughness. Of course, read. As he turned to begin a more detailed examination of Thorne's hands, a glint caught my eye. It was almost imperceptible, nestled deep within the singed fabric of his lab coat, near the cuff. Not glass, not ceramic. Something else. I leaned in closer, my magnifying loupe pressed against my eye. It was a minuscule cluster of crystalline particles, iridescent, catching the faint light from the overhead lamps. They weren't uniform like typical dust, nor were they the dull gray of concrete or the fine white of plaster. These shimmered with a faint, almost ethereal blue-green. "Hold on," I murmured, my voice barely audible. I carefully retrieved a sterile swab from my kit and, with painstaking precision, collected the tiny fragments. The examiner paused, watching me. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted, my brow furrowed. "But it's not from the lab. Not from any material I saw there." The particles had a distinct, almost mineral quality, unlike anything Thorne would have been working with. This was my first crack in the facade. A non-lab related trace element. It was small, but it was a deliberate misplaced thread in an otherwise perfectly woven narrative of an accident. It deepened my suspicion into a certainty. Thorne hadn't just died in a lab accident, he had been murdered. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look otherwise. The first reports from the preliminary interviews were waiting. My colleague, a young investigator with an eager demeanor, looked up as I entered. "Reed, we've got a couple of names that keep coming up," the colleague began, pushing a file across the desk. "A rival scientist and a former research assistant." I settled into my chair, the iridescent dust sample secured in a small vial in my pocket, a silent promise of answers. "Tell me about them." "The rival scientist is Dr. Silas Vance," the colleague explained, flipping open the file. "Same field as Thorne, equally brilliant, but apparently far less ethical. There was a public falling out a few months back. Thorne accused Vance of intellectual theft, specifically regarding a key component of Thorne's current research project. Vance denied it, of course, but the academic community was divided. Vance lost some funding, some prestige. I pictured the ambitious, cutthroat world of high-stakes research. A motive, certainly. Thorne's groundbreaking work could have been worth billions, a legacy that would overshadow any rival. And the former research assistant? Her name is Maya. She worked for Thorne for 3 years, until about 6 months ago. She claims Thorne fired her without cause, stole her contributions to his early research, and then blacklisted her from the industry. She's been struggling to find work since. Says Thorne was paranoid, secretive, and manipulative. I considered the two profiles. The rival scientist, driven by ambition and a sense of injustice. The former research assistant, fueled by resentment and a desire for revenge.
Both had plausible motives, both would have had some familiarity with Thorne's work, and potentially, the lab's layout and security protocols. The killer was sophisticated, meticulous, and intimately familiar with Thorne's world. The trace element, however, suggested an external influence, something brought in. My gaze drifted to the wall, where I'd pinned a rudimentary layout of Thorne's lab. The precision of the damage, the contained devastation, the subtle inconsistencies. It was all a carefully constructed lie. The killer wasn't just smart, they were a master of misdirection. The tension in my shoulders tightened, but it was a familiar weight. This was where the real hunt began. A minuscule, almost invisible speck. Found it embedded in the epidermal layer of his forearm, post-mortem. It's not organic, not metal, and certainly not anything we'd expect to find in a bioengineering lab. It's synthetic, almost like a microscopic piece of hardened plastic, but with a unique crystalline structure. The speck was barely visible to the naked eye, a testament to the ME's meticulous work. A non-lab-related trace element, embedded in Thorne's arm, suggesting a direct, intimate contact with something alien to his environment. The plot, as they say, thickened. My first stop for leads was Dr. Silas Vance, a contemporary of Thorne's and a known academic rival. His lab, a stark contrast to Thorne's high-tech fortress, was a maze of bubbling beakers and handwritten notes. Vance was a wiry man with a perpetual frown etched into his face, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke. Thorne was intense, Vance began, gesturing vaguely with a gloved hand. Brilliant, yes, but ruthless. He'd step on anyone to get ahead. My research, for example. He tried to discredit it, steal my funding. We had words, many times. Heated words. Did those words ever escalate to physical threats, Dr. Vance? I asked, observing his fidgeting hands. He scoffed. Please, read. I'm a scientist, not a brawler. And besides, I was at a conference in Geneva when the incident occurred. Plenty of witnesses. His alibi checked out, but his resentment was palpable. He had motive, certainly, but lacked opportunity for the physical act, and more importantly, the specific expertise to stage such a complex event. Next, I sought out Maya, Thorne's former research assistant. He was a young woman, sharp and intense, but now she seemed diminished, her shoulders slumped. I found her in the hum of the mass spectrometer filled the small analysis chamber, a low, steady thrum beneath the whine of the cooling systems. My eyes were fixed on the monitor, a grid of luminous data points plotting a complex, jagged topography. The microscopic particulate I'd painstakingly retrieved from the lab floor, a mere speck clinging to the edge of a singed conduit, was now being atomized, its constituent elements laid bare. I adjusted the focus, the spectral peaks sharpening into distinct patterns. My initial hunch had been that the trace would point to some exotic compound Thorne himself might have been working with, or perhaps a byproduct of an experimental reaction. Something that would neatly fit the narrative of a lab accident, or a desperate act by one of his rivals. But the initial sweep had shown nothing familiar, nothing that screamed bioengineering or academic grudge. It was alien to that environment. Ours bled into one another. I ran cross-references against known databases, filtering through millions of entries. Each failed match tightened the knot in my gut. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was an outlier, a deliberate deviation from the expected. The rival scientist, the former research assistant, their fingerprints, metaphorical or literal, wouldn't be found here. My gaze lingered on the screen, a particular cluster of peaks refusing to align with anything I knew. I isolated the signature, enhancing its resolution. Then, a flicker. A partial match. I refined the search parameters, inputting the specific elemental ratios. The system word, accessing a more specialized database, one dedicated to advanced materials, not biological compounds. The results populated the screen. My breath hitched. There it was, a rare, synthetic polymer. A composite material designed for extreme environments, boasting incredible tensile strength and heat resistance. It wasn't organic. It wasn't something you'd find in a high-security bioengineering lab, unless it was a component of the building itself, which I'd already ruled out. This polymer was used in high-end industrial applications, aerospace components, specialized robotics, deep-sea exploration vessels. Things that required unparalleled durability and discretion. This changed everything. My initial suspects, the ones driven by academic jealousy or personal vendettas, suddenly felt small, irrelevant. This polymer wasn't a casual trace, it was a deliberate choice, a material selected for its specific properties. It spoke of resources, of an organization with access to cutting-edge manufacturing, not just a disgruntled individual. It spoke of a motive far grander than intellectual property theft or professional slight. My thoughts immediately shifted to the source of Thorne's funding. His groundbreaking research, especially in its later stages, had been heavily subsidized by Omnicorp, a vast conglomerate known for its aggressive R&D acquisitions and a voracious appetite for innovation. They built everything from consumer electronics to advanced defense systems. This polymer, this unique signature, fit their profile perfectly. The redirect was jarring, like a sudden shift in the current of a powerful river. I pulled myself away from the screen, the fluorescent lights of the lab suddenly feeling too bright, too clinical. I needed to talk to Omnicorp, and I needed to do it now. Arranging a meeting with the corporate liaison was surprisingly easy. Too easy, perhaps. The representative, a sharp-suited executive with an unnervingly serene smile, met me in a sterile conference room within Omnicorp's downtown tower. The room offered a panoramic view of the city, a stark contrast to the confined, scorched remains of Thorne's lab. Reed, the liaison greeted, extending a manicured hand. "Thank you for coming. We're, of course, deeply saddened by Dr. Thorne's untimely demise. A brilliant mind, truly. A great loss to the scientific community, and to Omnicorp." Their voice was smooth, practiced, every syllable perfectly modulated. I bypassed the pleasantries. My investigation into Dr. Thorne's lab incident has taken a new turn. We've identified a trace element at the scene, a unique synthetic polymer, rarely seen outside highly specialized industrial applications. I watched their eyes for a flicker, a tell. The liaison maintained their composed expression, a slight tilt of the head the only indication they'd registered my words. "Indeed? That's intriguing. What kind of polymer?" "One used in high-stress, high-temperature environments. Something that suggests specific, engineered properties. Omnicorp, as I understand it, has significant interests in advanced materials research. Do you recognize such a compound?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly.
Omnicorp's portfolio is vast, read.
We develop thousands of proprietary materials annually. To pinpoint a specific polymer without more information would be challenging, they replied, their words carefully chosen, like stones placed in a defensive wall. However, I can assure you, none of our materials would have been present in Dr. Thorne's lab unless they were components of equipment we provided, or perhaps, part of a prototype he was developing with our funding. Was any such equipment or prototype utilizing this type of specialized polymer present in his lab? Not to my knowledge, the liaison said, their gaze unwavering. Dr. Thorne's work was primarily biological. While our Advanced Materials Division occasionally consults, his direct projects rarely involved such heavy industrial composites. The structural integrity of his lab, for instance, was standard construction, not aerospace grade. Their cooperation felt forced, too eager, almost as if they were reading from a script designed to deflect. They offered to provide a comprehensive list of all materials supplied to Thorne's lab, a gesture of transparency that felt more like a distraction. We are committed to assisting your investigation in any way we can, read. We value our reputation, and Dr. Thorne's legacy. Any information you require, we will endeavor to provide. I noted the subtle emphasis on endeavor. Did Dr. Thorne have any external collaborators, outside of Omnicorp's oversight, who might have access to such materials? The liaison paused, a fractional hesitation. Not that we were aware of. Our funding agreements typically restrict such external engagements to protect intellectual property, but Dr. Thorne was, shall we say, a fiercely independent researcher. It's possible he pursued avenues unknown to us, though unlikely, given the security protocols. Unlikely, but not impossible. The evasiveness, the overly polished demeanor, the carefully constructed answers, it all built a new kind of tension in the room. This wasn't just about a dead scientist anymore, it was about a corporate entity protecting its secrets, its investments. Leaving the tower, the city's din felt sharper, more aggressive. The rival scientist and the former research assistant were still possibilities, but now they were secondary. The trail of that polymer led straight to the heart of corporate power, and it hummed with a different kind of danger. I had to re-examine everything, starting with the source. I found myself contemplating the journey back to the trauma center cold room awaiting examination, a new set of questions forming in my mind about Thorne himself, and what secrets his body might still hold. Leaving the tower, the corporate executive's polished evasiveness still clung to me like a fine dust. It wasn't just about Thorne's death anymore, it was about a corporate entity protecting its secrets, its investments. My gut clenched with the certainty that they knew more than they were letting on, and their silence was a louder statement than any confession. My focus narrowed back to the anomalous polymer. I spent the next few hours buried in my personal lab, sifting through materials science databases, cross-referencing spectroscopic data against every known industrial composite. The trace I'd found on Thorne's person was unique, subtly different from anything listed as standard lab equipment. It suggested a specialized application, a custom blend, or something so new it hadn't been cataloged. My screen glowed with schematics and molecular structures, each one a dead end until I finally hit a partial match. A proprietary material, recently patented, used in advanced thermal shielding applications. The manufacturer wasn't public knowledge, but the patent holder was a shell company with an address linked to a major tech conglomerate, the same one that had a significant stake in Thorne's research. The connection was too clean, too neat. I leaned back, rubbing the bridge of my nose.
This wasn't a random accident.
Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths, not just to kill Thorne, but to cover their tracks with a material that screamed accident to the untrained eye. The evening air was sharp and cold as I left my building. My mind was still running through the implications of the polymer, the corporate ties, the carefully constructed alibis. I was halfway to my car, crossing the dimly lit parking lot, when the roar of an engine shattered the quiet. A dark sedan, headlights off, surged from behind a row of parked vans. It wasn't just moving fast, it was accelerating, veering directly towards me. My reflexes, honed by years of walking into unpredictable scenes, kicked in. I dove to my right, scrambling behind the nearest concrete pillar as the vehicle screeched past, its side mirror barely clearing the edge of my temporary cover. The air whipped around me, carrying the acrid scent of burnt rubber. The sedan didn't pause, didn't even tap its brakes, vanishing into the night without a trace. I pushed myself up, my palms scraped, my breath ragged. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it wasn't fear I felt, not entirely. This wasn't a random incident. Someone knew I was getting too close. Back in my personal lab, the subtle shift in the air was almost imperceptible. A faint scent, like ozone mixed with something metallic, lingered. My gaze swept the room, cataloging every detail. The stack of analytical reports on my desk was perfectly aligned, just as I'd left it. The microscope was covered. My personal locker, where I kept sensitive samples, showed no sign of forced entry. But my eye caught it, a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the polished chrome edge of my primary mass spectrometer. It wasn't new, it had been there for months. But the dust that usually collected in its tiny groove was gone, wiped clean. A meticulous hand had been at work, not breaking in, but checking. Checking what I was working on, what I had found. The realization settled deep in my bones. They hadn't just tried to scare me, they had breached my sanctuary. They were inside my head, anticipating my moves. I was here to retrieve a specific tissue sample from Thorne's original examination, a deeper epidermal layer I'd asked the lead medical examiner to preserve. The medical examiner, a man whose weary eyes held decades of grim experience, nodded curtly as I signed the release forms. "Still digging, Reed," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "Always," I replied, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. The air in here was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something deeper, more primal. Thorne lay on a stainless steel gurney, covered by a sheet. I carefully peeled back the corner, revealing the still, pale face. The burn patterns, the initial cause of death, seemed almost secondary to the invisible threat I now felt closing in. I carefully took the sample, my movements precise, my mind racing. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered, my voice guarded. "Reed? I need to tell you something. I think I'm in trouble." My stomach tightened. "What is it, Maya? Where are you?" "I'm at home." I shouldn't have called, but I can't. I can't keep it to myself anymore. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. After our last conversation, I started thinking about Thorne. About how careful he was. And then I remembered something. Something I saw. "What did you see?" I pressed, my voice calm, but my grip on the phone tightening. "A few times," she stammered,
in the weeks before. Before it happened. Late at night. I'd come back to the lab, sometimes to finish up, sometimes I'd forgotten something. And the security lights. They'd be on. Not all of them, just in Thorne's section. And I heard noises. Faint ones, like equipment running, but not the usual hum. And I saw. Moving inside. Not Thorne. He always had his specific way of moving. This was different. And once, I saw someone leave. Through the service entrance, very late. Not a regular employee. I couldn't make out their face, but they were tall. I just assumed it was a late-night delivery or a contractor. Thorne was always bringing in specialists. But now. After everything you've said, his voice cracked. I'm scared, Reed. Really scared. My mind raced, connecting the dots. An unknown individual, accessing Thorne's lab after hours, just weeks before his death. This wasn't just a corporate secret, it was a deliberate, calculated intrusion. Maya's confession was the final piece confirming my worst suspicions. This wasn't just a murder, it was a conspiracy, and I was now squarely in its crosshairs. The sterile chill of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination seeped into my bones, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from the portable workstation I'd set up on a stainless steel cart. The air hummed with the low thrum of refrigeration units, a constant, mournful drone. Thorne's remains were still here, secured, awaiting the next stage of examination, but my focus was elsewhere, deep within the labyrinthine data of his lab's control systems. Hours blurred into a relentless cycle of scrolling, cross-referencing, and pattern recognition. My fingers danced across the keyboard, navigating through terabytes of sensor logs, access records, network traffic, and environmental control data. The lab, a marvel of bespoke engineering, had generated a colossal digital footprint, and somewhere within it lay the killer's shadow. I started with the environmental controls. Thorne's lab was designed to be a sealed ecosystem for his sensitive bioengineering work, capable of precise atmospheric manipulation. Initial reports had cited a sudden, catastrophic oxygen depletion as the cause of the explosion, followed by a rapid pressure surge. But the raw data told a different story. The first anomaly appeared not as a sudden drop, but a subtle, almost imperceptible increase in a specific inert gas, nitrogen, over a period of 30 minutes, starting an hour before the primary incident. It was incremental, too slow to trigger immediate alarms, yet enough to gradually dilute the oxygen levels in the sealed chamber. This wasn't a system malfunction, it was a deliberate, controlled alteration. Then came the timestamps for the equipment. Thorne's primary bioreactor, the one central to his most sensitive experiments, showed a series of unusual commands. Not errors, but overrides. Safety protocols, designed to prevent runaway reactions, had been systematically bypassed. The temperature regulator was nudged up by a fraction of a degree, then another, then a third. The nutrient pump, instead of delivering a measured dose, was briefly engaged in a continuous flow, then abruptly cut. Each command was precise, almost surgical, mimicking the kind of minute adjustments a researcher might make, but without Thorne's biometric authentication. My gaze flickered to the access logs. That entry from weeks ago, the unknown individual using a stolen biometric key. I overlaid the timestamps. The nitrogen introduction, the bioreactor overrides,
they didn't align directly with that physical intrusion. The intrusion was a setup, the actual trigger was remote.
A jolt went through me. I pulled up the lab's network activity.
There it was, a series of encrypted packets, originating from an external IP address, relayed through a compromised server halfway across the globe.
The packets were small, fragmented, designed to blend in with background network noise. But their destination was unmistakable: Thorne's lab environmental control server and the bespoke bioreactor's operational interface.
This wasn't an accident. This was a symphony of sabotage, conducted remotely.
First, the gradual nitrogen infusion, subtly choking the atmosphere, creating a hypoxic environment.
Then, the precise, timed overrides on the bioreactor, the incremental temperature increases, the nutrient pump manipulation. These weren't random acts, they were designed to push Thorne's specific, highly sensitive biological compounds to their breaking point, to create a critical mass of instability.
The final act was the most brutal in its simplicity.
A command, disguised as a routine system check, initiated a rapid depressurization sequence, then immediately reversed it, causing a violent pressure surge within the already compromised bioreactor. The sudden change in pressure, combined with the volatile, superheated compounds and the oxygen-depleted atmosphere, created the perfect conditions for a catastrophic, localized explosion. It was designed to look like a tragic research malfunction, a brilliant mind pushing the boundaries too far.
My breath hitched. The killer hadn't just known the lab layout, they'd known Thorne's specific experimental protocols.
They understood the precise tolerances of his compounds, the exact parameters that would lead to instability, and how to manipulate the bespoke systems to achieve it. This wasn't a random act of corporate espionage, it was an intimate betrayal. Someone had studied Thorne's work, perhaps even collaborated with him, to this level of detail.
The implications were immense.
This narrowed the field of suspects from a nebulous corporate rival to someone within Thorne's inner circle, someone with privileged access to his research, his methodologies, and the intricate workings of his custom-built sanctuary. The individual who had breached the lab weeks earlier had likely installed a discreet listening device or a data tap, allowing them to gather the intimate knowledge required for this remote execution.
My eyes scanned the data once more, confirming every detail.
The precision, the remote execution, the intimate knowledge, it painted a portrait of a killer who was not only brilliant but utterly ruthless. And they were still out there, weaving through the same corporate corridors, perhaps even observing my investigation, confident their meticulously engineered accident would hold. Used in their most exclusive and expensive equipment.
Stuff that isn't just sold on the open market. Omnicorp. The name echoed Maya's vague warnings of them.
A multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with a voracious appetite for R&D, known for acquiring cutting-edge technology and stifling competition. They had been a major financier of Thorne's research, pouring vast sums into his lab. The trace element on Thorne's body wasn't just a random piece of debris, it was a corporate fingerprint, leading directly to the heart of a powerful entity. I secured an interview with Omnicorp's liaison, a polished executive named Mr. Davies. He arrived at the precinct in a tailored suit, exuding an air of carefully constructed professionalism. His smile was too wide, his handshake too firm. "A tragic loss, Dr. Thorne," Davies began, settling into the interview room chair, his voice smooth as silk.
"A visionary. Omnicorp is devastated by this incident."
"Mr. Davies," I cut to the chase, placing the evidence bag with the polymer speck on the table between us. This was found on Dr. Thorne.
Our analysis points to a proprietary polymer manufactured exclusively by Omnicorp. Can you explain its presence? Davies's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Ah, yes. Our chronoresin. Remarkable material. We use it in many of our high-performance systems. It's possible a piece of equipment in Dr. Thorne's lab might have incorporated it. We supplied him with a vast array of specialized instruments, you understand. State-of-the-art. Was any of that equipment designed to withstand the kind of heat that would melt down an entire lab? I pressed. Our equipment is robust, Reed. Designed for extreme conditions. Perhaps a component failed, leading to a chain reaction. These things happen in experimental science. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. Omnicorp has been fully cooperative, offering all assistance. We've even offered to provide our own internal investigators to help with the cleanup. We want answers as much as you do. His overly cooperative demeanor, the eagerness to offer assistance, the subtle redirecting of responsibility, it all felt like a carefully rehearsed performance. He wasn't just a liaison, he was a gatekeeper, protecting Omnicorp's interests, and possibly, its secrets. The polymer was a direct link, but Davies was doing his best to make it seem innocuous, a mere byproduct of their generous support. That accidents started subtly, a creeping unease that quickly escalated into undeniable threats. I was leaving the precinct one evening, my mind still replaying Davies's evasive answers, when a black sedan, appearing from nowhere, swerved violently towards me at an intersection. The screech of tires, the blare of the horn, the rush of wind as it narrowly missed me, it was too close, too deliberate to be random. I felt the chilling certainty that I was no longer just investigating, I was being warned. The next incident was more personal. I returned to my personal lab, a small, cluttered space in the police department basement where I often process sensitive samples away from prying eyes, to find a precise, almost surgical disruption. Nothing was stolen, nothing overtly damaged. But my microscope was slightly off-kilter, a sterile swab had been moved from its designated tray, and a faint, almost metallic scent lingered in the air, something I couldn't immediately identify, but knew wasn't usually present. It was a message, we know where you work. We can get to you. The threat solidified my resolve. Someone was actively trying to impede Thorne's remains were still awaiting full examination, a grim irony given the trap I was laying. I ran a gloved hand over the cold metal surface of the nearby examination table, the frost biting through the latex. This was the perfect crucible for my final gamble. I had been working for hours, meticulously crafting the bait. A fabricated report, complete with a forged signature from a fictional lead researcher, detailed a breakthrough in Aris Thorne's polymer research. Not just any breakthrough, but one specifically pertaining to the unusual bioreactive properties of the polymer I'd found, the same one present at my own staged accident and the one subtly altered in Aris's final experiment. I knew the killer, intimately familiar with Aris's work, would recognize its significance immediately, a threat to their carefully constructed narrative. I printed out a single copy, leaving it conspicuously face-up on my workstation, beside a secure data chip I'd intentionally left accessible. The chip contained the same false data, encrypted just enough to pique curiosity, but not so much as to be impenetrable to someone desperate. My internal clock ticked past midnight. The cold room was quiet, save for the hum. I'd arranged for the loan attendant to take an extended break, a small favor called in from an old contact. The security cameras in this particular section of the building, I'd been assured, were intermittently offline for the next few hours. Convenient. A figure slipped inside, moving with a practiced stealth that belied their civilian attire. David Thorne. His eyes, even in the dim emergency lighting, scanned the room with a predatory intensity. He moved directly to my workstation, his gaze falling instantly on the printout. A flicker of something, recognition, panic, calculation, crossed his face. He snatched the report, his fingers trembling slightly, then fumbled for the data chip. He inserted it into a small, handheld device he'd produced from his jacket pocket, his brow furrowed in concentration. The soft glow from his device illuminated his features, tight with a desperate urgency. He muttered something under his breath, a low, guttural sound of frustration as he tried to access the encrypted data. He wasn't just observing, he was attempting to neutralize. He was destroying evidence, the false evidence I'd left. Looking for something, David? I stepped out of the alcove, my voice cutting through the hum of the refrigeration units, echoing in the confined space. He froze, the data chip still clutched in his hand, his head snapping towards my voice. His eyes, wide with shock, reflected the dim light. Read? What? It was a fabrication. A lure. And you took the bait. He tried to recover, a desperate laugh escaping him. A lure? Don't be absurd. I was just curious. Saw the light on. Curious enough to try and destroy my findings? I countered, stepping closer. Curious enough to know exactly what bioreactive polymer with altered isotopic signature meant, when no one else in the building would have? I pulled a small, sealed evidence bag from my pocket. This is from the accident scene where my own research nearly went up in smoke. The same polymer, with the same unique isotopic signature, that was found in trace amounts in Aris's ventilation system, specifically engineered to be activated by a specific frequency of sonic vibration. A frequency you, with your intimate knowledge of your brother's work, would have known to use to destabilize his experiment. He dropped the crumpled report, his shoulders slumping. He was going to expose them, David finally choked out, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the hum. Aris. He found out about the bioweapon development. Omnicorp. Not the whole company, just a faction. They were twisting his research, making it lethal. He wouldn't stand for it. He threatened to go public, expose their entire operation. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound despair. They came to me. Told me he was a liability. That his idealism would ruin everything, bring down not just the faction, but the entire corporation, costing thousands of jobs. They said I had to neutralize him. Make it look like an accident. They gave me the access, the schematics, the frequencies. They knew I was the only one who could get close enough, who knew his routines, his paranoia. His eyes met mine, filled with a desperate plea for understanding. They promised to protect me, protect his legacy. The accident in Aris Thorne's lab, the subtle clues I'd chased through the sterile corridors and across the city, now converged into a single, horrifying truth. The metallic tang of ozone still clung to my nostrils,
a phantom echo of the lab's destruction, but here, in the trauma center cold room awaiting examination, the air was scrubbed clean, sterile, and terribly cold. My breath plumed faintly in front of me as I stood beside the stainless steel gurney, a sheet-draped form beneath it.
Aris Thorne.
His brother, David, was already in custody, the weight of his confession still pressing on my mind, a chilling testament to the depths of familial betrayal and corporate ambition. A technician, a gaunt individual with weary eyes, adjusted the temperature dial on a nearby console.
"Just confirming protocols, investigator," the technician murmured, not quite meeting my gaze.
"The official record needs
finalization." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the outline beneath the sheet. It was done.
Aris hadn't died from a miscalculation, he'd been murdered, his groundbreaking work coveted and stolen by his own kin. The thought twisted in my gut, a bitter knot.
How many times had I seen ambition curdle into something monstrous? Too many.
Outside this insulated chamber, the world was already alight with the news.
My portable device, vibrating intermittently in my pocket, signaled a barrage of updates.
The initial reports, carefully crafted by Omnicorp to paint Aris's death as a tragic accident, were being systematically dismantled. The investigative team, bolstered by my findings, had moved swiftly.
High-profile arrests within Omnicorp's executive tier had begun almost immediately after David Thorne's apprehension.
Names that once resonated with power and influence were now being dragged through the mud, their carefully constructed reputations shattering under the glare of public scrutiny. A colleague, a seasoned investigator from the Federal Division, met me by the double doors. "It's a firestorm, Reed," the colleague said, running a hand through their short, practical haircut.
"The media's having a field day." Omnicorp's stock just plummeted another 10 points.
"They deserved it," I replied, the words clipped. "They built their empire on secrets and now it's collapsing under the weight of a dead man's brilliance." The colleague sighed, leaning against the sterile wall.
"The public outcry is immense. Questions about corporate oversight, the ethics of unchecked scientific advancement. It's everywhere. Pundits on every channel are demanding accountability."
I pictured the headlines, the screaming chirons. They should. Aris Thorne's work. It wasn't just about profit margins. It had implications, real-world consequences beyond their greed. And those consequences were now the real battleground. Aris's research, the very project that had cost him his life, was a prize. Governments across the globe, sensing the magnitude of what had been developed, were already maneuvering. I'd received discreet calls, veiled inquiries, and thinly disguised demands for access to the recovered data. International organizations, usually slow to react, were dispatching envoys. The technology Aris had perfected, capable of revolutionary changes in energy, medicine, or even defense, was too significant to be left in limbo. It was a power vacuum, and everyone wanted to fill it. The government's setting up a task force, my colleague continued, confirming my suspicions. To secure all of Thorne's remaining intellectual property. They're talking about a joint international committee to decide its future. A committee, I scoffed softly. As if that will keep it out of the wrong hands. Money and power will always find a way. The weight of it all settled on my shoulders. I had uncovered the truth behind Aris Thorne's death, brought his killer and the orchestrators of the cover-up to justice. But the truth, once unearthed, rarely stayed contained. It spread, evolved, and often created new problems. The immediate, brutal betrayal had been resolved, but the wider implications, the ethical quagmire surrounding Aris's legacy, felt like an entirely new, unquantifiable mystery. I thought of Aris, brilliant and reclusive, driven by a vision that had ultimately consumed him. He had sought to change the world, and in his death, he had succeeded, though perhaps not in the way he had ever intended. The storm was just beginning, and I, the one who had first seen the subtle, contradictory evidence, found myself standing at its epicenter, weary but resolute. My job was done, but the world was only just beginning to grapple with the aftermath of Aris Thorne's final project.
Environment primed for extreme combustion.
The catalytic agent lowered the ignition threshold.
The energy surge in the adjacent workstation was the spark, timed perfectly to ignite the volatile reagents, not in Thorne's main area.
Near it, creating a directed blast. The structural engineers, cross-referencing this data with the physical damage, pointed to the geometric scorch mark I had noticed on my first visit.
That mark, Reed, one of them explained, it's consistent with the point of initial, superheated impact.
The energy surge was channeled, focused, hitting that precise spot first, creating a flashpoint for the larger conflagration. It was designed to look like a spontaneous, chaotic explosion, but the initial trigger was pinpoint accurate. The picture snapped into terrifying clarity. That accident was a sophisticated, multi-stage act of murder. The killer hadn't just blown up a lab, they had engineered a fatal event that mimicked a research malfunction, triggered remotely, designed to eliminate Thorne and destroy his critical research. The method pointed to someone with an expert, almost intimate, knowledge of Thorne's specific protocols, his bespoke lab systems, and the volatile nature of his Project Chimera. The culprit had understood Thorne's work better than anyone, perhaps even better than Thorne himself. They knew the precise vulnerabilities, the exact sequence of events that would create a devastating, yet perfectly deniable, catastrophe. The rare synthetic polymer, the distinct scent, the digital manipulation, the engineered blast, all pieces of a meticulously crafted puzzle. I had the how, the what, and the why. Thorne's identity-altering research was either too valuable to be left in his hands, or too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The killer, hidden behind layers of corporate power and carefully orchestrated sabotage, had erased Thorne's identity, alone.